Dr. Lydia Miljan, political science professor from the University of Windsor. She received her PhD at the University of Calgary and worked in policy research for over 30 years for a not-for-profit, and then she got into academia. Her current research focuses on electoral reform and municipal policy. So wonderful to have you here, and thank you kindly for joining the Magnifying Glass Podcast.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I was really intrigued by that CBC article. I honestly never really thought much about fringe parties and splinter parties. It's not something I really learned much in political science, so that article kind of opened my eyes a little bit more.
I'm trying to remember which article you're talking about.
I think the title says, Windsor professor says fringe parties and splinter parties have a place to say. I think it was from 2 years ago.
Okay, so I just quoted in it, I guess.
Okay. Yes, it touched on COVID.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah. So I just want to open up and say we know that there are 5 represented parties in Parliament with official party status that voice their political concerns in Parliament. However, there are quite a few fringe parties and splinter parties registered through Elections Canada, but are not represented in the House of Commons in Ottawa. None of them have seats whatsoever. So my first question to open is, what do you think the overall purpose and value is when it comes to fringe parties and splinter parties in Canada?
Well, I think in general, when you have a splinter party, so let's just define the terms. A splinter party assumes that they were part of a main political party, and there's disenchantment with that party, either in their policy or their leadership, and there's a breakaway group. So examples of successful splinter parties would be, say, the Reform Party. Really, the Reform Party broke away from the Progressive Conservatives. Some of their members did, or even probably more accurately, the Bloc Québécois, right? The Bloc Québécois was formed initially of disenfranchised conservatives who weren't happy with negotiations on the Constitution. So that I would define as a splinter party. A fringe party is a little bit different. This is a party that is more extreme in their ideological positions, and so you could say, as examples, the Marxist-Leninist Party in Canada would be a fringe party. They represent a very hard left position and is on the fringes of sort of the normal curve.
That's a good distinction. Would you say splinter parties have more momentum, or it's easier for them to gain traction compared to the fringe parties, I imagine?
Well, that certainly has been our example. I mean, obviously the Bloc Québécois are still around, and even the Reform Party, if you look at their history, they were quite effective for their time. They certainly helped wipe out the Progressive Conservatives in the 93 election, but that their success was limited to Western regions, and they really couldn't form a national party, and so that's why they ended up, merging with the Progressive Conservatives and forming the new Conservative Party of Canada. And I think that's sort of the overall message about fringe or splinter parties is that, if you aren't getting elected, you got to kind of wonder why. What are you in it for? And certainly, if you think about my example, the Marxist-Leninists, they're obviously in it to talk about their certain policy areas. They don't want to dilute their message, but their history has been one that they have never been able to elect anyone in the House of Commons, and so they represent an ideology, I think, at best.
That's a very good point. I didn't think of it that way. Yeah. For my next question, I read that the CBC News that I think it was 2 years ago, almost 65,000 Canadians voted for minor parties in the last election, but none won a seat, unfortunately. So my question is, what makes it difficult and challenging for fringe parties and splinter parties to gain political traction and obtain a seat in parliament? Is it to do with popularity? Will the first past the post system act as a barrier as well for fringe parties and splinter parties? Is it to do with the two-party system? Things like that?
Well, the thing about, Canadian politics is that all parties really have, our electoral system is based on parties, even though it's not in the Constitution. You have to command, you have to have the confidence of the Parliament. And so to do that, we organize in parties. So parties are always sort of coalitions of groups, right? There's no pure party. The NDP is a coalition of social activists who range from people who are advocating for, same-sex rights to traditional union voters to people in, the farming communities. The Conservatives also have a mix of social conservatives, libertarians, as well as fiscal conservatives, the liberal, so all of these parties, the point here is all the parties are a coalition of groups. The issue with the fringe party is that they are pure to their ideology and they do not want to compromise, but politics is all about compromise. Most of us are sort of in that mushy middle. And so the reason is quite simple. Electoral math is such that there's just not enough people who have that pure ideology of the fringe party, and that's what makes it so much more difficult for them to subsequently get elected and get seats. If they start merging with other smaller parties, then they become much more likely to be able to become an effective party insofar as they could get people elected. So like the Green Party is sort of stuck at 3 seats. There doesn't seem to be, because they're not really compromising on key positions. They seem to be a one policy party. And so I'm not necessarily thinking that we can blame the electoral system. It's more about the nature of those parties themselves and the people who choose to join them.
That's very true. We have a pure ideology that's, very concrete, and it's just very narrow focused. It's very difficult to maybe get support like that, because there's only a handful of people that support it or really espouse it. And another difficulty is that it's already difficult besides the Liberals and Conservatives, like the NDP and the Greens. Even though they have seats, it's still very difficult. I believe with the Orange Wave, with Jack Layton, the NDP finally secured a lot of seats with that election. So it just goes to show that even the bigger parties, both the Liberals and Conservatives, it is harder to gain seats.
Right, it's always a challenge. I mean, the 2011 election, the reason why the NDP did so well is that Jack Layton was able to connect with a particular region, and that was Quebec, and so he was able to pull a lot of those Bloc Quebec squash seats away from that party, and after that election they were down to single digits. So that was a real breakthrough for them, but no other NDP leader has been able to make that connection with Quebec. So, again, that's not because of the electoral system. That's not because of the parties themselves. That has to do with the leadership and whether or not the public likes who's running for that party and who's representing that party.
Oh, that's very true. It was an incredible election. It just changed the history of NDP politics for sure. So my next question is, when it comes to splinter parties, why is it important for splinter parties to voice their political concerns in opposition to the represented parties in Parliament? Is it seen as a democratic limelight, especially example in terms of Alberta and the People's Party of Canada, as well as the Maverick Party, which is a federal party, the Liberal Party? It seems that party discipline is not always easy when a minority wants to voice their political concerns within a mainstream party?
Yeah, I mean, the examples that you just put forward are certainly examples of individuals not being happy with the current Conservative Party of Canada.
Right.
You know, I mean, the People's Party, again, that's Maxime Bernier, who was disenchanted with the Conservatives when he lost his leadership race, and so he forms his own party. But you know, apart from initial interest and the disruption of the 2021 election, where they were able to take away. They didn't really win any seats, but they pulled votes away for the Conservatives, which helped the Liberals maintain their minority government. They really haven't been that effective, and even in the latest by-election, Maxime Bernier still can't even win a seat. So, you know, I think that's more to do with Maxime Bernier. As for the Mavericks and the True Blue, I mean, again, a lot of that was a consequence of COVID, and some of it was provincial. So there were a lot of people in provincial politics that, even though you had Conservative governments in power in those provinces, there are people on the right who were deeply dissatisfied with, you know, the different mandates, the shutdowns, the vaccines, and so that was their ability to voice their concerns. But you know, if you look at the 22 provincial election in Ontario, even with these splinter groups, even with people who used to sit, I mean, that's really true definition of a splinter group. They used to sit with the Progressive Conservative and sought re-election. None of them were successful, and not only that, but then you know, Doug Ford was able to get another even stronger majority government. So, you know, the motivations for these parties, I think, matter, and I think that the public really, you know, they can figure out the motivations of them. And I think that these recent parties are really personal grievance parties, as opposed to the Reform Party, which was more about, you know, Mr. Mulroney, you promised us that the West would have a say if we voted for you. We lived through the Liberal years, the National Energy Program. You were going to make things better, and we still feel left behind. And so what Preston Manning was able to do is, especially in Western Canada, is tap into that deep discontent within the core Conservative movement, and with slogans like "The West wants in," "We want fair representation," "We want a Triple E Senate." So they weren't just, you know, Preston Manning had never been part of the Conservative government. He really was an outsider formulating and just a new vision. And I think no one was more surprised than them when they had the success that they did in the 93 election. But again, there's a big context for that. You know, a lot of things happened before that, and the big test of it was the failure of Canadians to support the Charlottetown Accord. And Preston Manning really made a name for himself in campaigning against the Charlottetown Accord, and that's what really helped propel them to victory in 93.
Well said. That's very true. It's interesting how provincial politics can play a role in terms of creating their own parties and distinction, because provinces in a way are kind of cultural and political. Like they have their own set beliefs in a way, especially like you said with Alberta and the West. So for my next question, it kind of follows through what you said about Alberta. If Alberta were to have more provincial recognition and became culturally distinctive in comparison to Quebec in terms of having provincial political parties, because Quebec does, would that help alleviate the provincial tensions with the federal government and Alberta?
I'm not really sure what you mean by not having its own political culture or distinct political party. I mean, Alberta has always had sort of unique political parties. I mean, certainly there were the Lougheed and Klein years with progressive conservatives, but, you know, they had Social Credit before that with William Eberhard, and now they have the United Conservative Party, which is, again, a merger between the old PCs and the new Wild Rose party. So the issue with Alberta is that it contributes so much for the economy, but doesn't have the
Right.
seats, and in part, again, when people talk about electoral reform, they always just go to, oh, we should change the electoral system. My bone of contention with the electoral system is the way in which seats are allocated. We do not have proportionality even in the seats, right? If you think about the fact that Prince Edward Island, which is not even the size of a small city, gets 3 seats. Always, right? They are mandated to have that.
Yes.
Their vote counts so much more in that region, and not just Prince Edward Island, but the maritime provinces in general. Their votes count that much more. When you look at Alberta, some of their ridings are like 140,000 people, whereas some of the eastern ridings are like maybe 70, 80,000 people. So it's not one person, one vote the way our electoral system works. And that is part of the concern about Alberta, is that, they have a growing population and they've increased a few seats from time to time, but it doesn't fairly represent the number of people who live there. And more importantly, it doesn't represent their contribution to the economy of the country. And so you have situations where Quebec, with its over 70 seats, has just a larger voice in the Confederation, and they're able to block major things like Energy East pipeline because the Liberals, that wasn't popular in Quebec, and the Liberals wanted those seats in Quebec, and so it makes it that much more difficult for Albertans to get their oil to market, and so that I think is the issue. If you're going to go for electoral reform, it would be, in my mind, it would be increase the number of seats in the House of Commons and make sure that every riding has within, 2,000 individuals the same proportion of voters, and that's the only way it can be truly representative of the geographic variability within the country.
That's very interesting. I didn't think of it that way. Thank you for sharing that. I also wanted to ask, I imagine the carbon tax might have fueled more conflict with Alberta, especially since they couldn't really voice their opinion on that because it's a federal bill, I believe, that was passed. I think Ontario and Alberta, I don't know if it's Saskatchewan, but there's quite a few provinces that are really adamant and against the carbon tax.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there was a court challenge with Alberta, Ontario, Saskatchewan, I think also Manitoba, could be wrong on that one, where they took the federal government to court saying that they didn't have the ability to regulate. This is the regulation, and they were encroaching on provincial territory. The Supreme Court turned them down, and so the federal so those provinces, and Ontario included, don't have a carbon tax, but we have the federally imposed backstop, and that's how that works out. I'm not sure what your question is, though.
Oh, I just wanted to just slightly touch on the carbon tax. I think it fueled more separatism for Alberta in a way. That's just what I've read over.
So I missed that word. It feels more what?
Oh, sorry.
I missed the word you said. It's something more for Alberta? It did what from?
Oh, I just read when that carbon tax was passed, I think it fueled more conflict with Parliament with Alberta.
Oh, yeah.
Because they didn't.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah. It does, just because they see that as, again, Alberta and the federal government tend to disagree a lot, especially when there's opposite parties involved. And, they were hard hit by the recession. They were hard hit by COVID. Mm-hmm. And, let's face it, their number one export is still oil. And so when you have a federal government trying to shut down an industry, there's going to create tension.
Exactly. I just find that very interesting how there's one province that doesn't get along. And with the federal government, it's just some people think that provinces should have more autonomy that way, perhaps. So for my next question is back to fringe parties and splinter parties. Do fringe parties and splinter parties, do you think they divide Canada and provinces in a way, even though they're minor, as in Does it make politics more difficult or challenging? Does it make it more progressive? Does it make it harder if there's just so many political parties to choose from? Are there any negatives to fringe parties and splinter parties at all?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I'm of the view that actually we're better off with fewer rather than more parties, and that's one of my criticisms of a proportional representation or alternative vote system, because what that tends to do is it tends to reward those smaller parties, and it doesn't lead to compromise. I think that, if my utopia vision is that you have people who disagree on different sides of an issue, that's fine, but that people form groups that they realize that you can't have everything you want, that there's always going to be compromise in politics. And so in having 2 or 3 parties that comprise of people who have compromised on issues, you've already seen what that coalition looks like. And what happens in a PR system when you have all these splinter groups and fringe parties is it's a lot of noise, and it's people who aren't willing to compromise. They're going to put out extreme positions, which is their right to do, but we don't want to reward that. You certainly don't want to have cases like we see in other countries with proportional representation, where some of those fringe parties actually are able to form government later on because of the way the vote falls, or because of the compromise or the negotiation that happens after the fact, that basically isn't something that the public consented to. It's what the political parties decide amongst themselves, sort of dividing the spoils. So I don't have a problem with splinter parties trying and forming new ideas, but ultimately there's got to be compromise in politics. Otherwise, you have very unreasonable people running things.
Exactly. I agree wholeheartedly. It kind of also reminds me of the fact that with the official party registered parties on the federal level, it's just not everyone's going to agree with the ideologies in those parties or the policies or the bills that are being brought up in legislation. And that's why you'll see independent MPs, they'll leave the party. It just reminds me of the fringe and splinter party idea in a way. Just when one person doesn't follow party discipline exactly and wants to leave and follow their own path.
Yeah, and again, you have to look at the situations and the context. Sometimes it's because the party has changed, or it's a point of principle. I mean, I think that Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott sitting as independents, I think that was a point of principle that they left. It wasn't that they were changing ideologies. It's just that they felt that they no longer had confidence in the prime minister and sat as independents, which is a little bit different than, say, being kicked out of the party, as sometimes happens. So there's also a reason why people become independent. But yeah, you're not going to.
A little embarrassing.
But if you're an independent MP, you've got nothing. You're not going to be able to be part of the policy debate. At least if you're in a party, either opposition or government, you're part of where the real debates happen, which is in the caucus meetings. You can push the party in different directions. Being outside the party system, it means you're just you're taking up a seat, but your ability to be effective for your constituents or for the policy debate or the issues that you're concerned about are severely limited.
Very true. It weakens your voice in a way because you're kind of isolated. You don't have that political support and traction to back you up. You're kind of on your own, and people might have mixed views with the independent MP. There's really enough seats. I kind of like to see more independent MPs. So for my next question, so this is just sort of an utopian idea question. What would it look like if all splinter parties and fringe parties were able to gain one seat in Parliament? What would that mean for Canadian politics? Would having that political microphone be useful and beneficial for Canada? Would it cause more friction and blurry the lines of Canadian politics?
I don't think it makes a big impact. I mean, let's look, if you want to have an example, let's take a look at the Green Party. It doesn't have official party status because the numbers are so low, right? When you're looking at, the way in which Parliament is organized, you have to have a certain block of seats in order to even be able to ask questions to the Prime Minister. And so, the Green Party talks about green policies and maybe they push the green agenda, but I would say the NDP and the Liberals are very much on side with the green policy. So, to what extent they've made any impact or any difference, I think that they're a distraction. It frustrates me as someone who has to watch the leaders' debates, that we have all these people on stage who have no chance ever to become form government, and so it takes away time from the parties that do have a chance to debate each other and discuss their issues.
That's very true. Yeah. Interesting perspective. I also wanted to ask, in terms of the Splinter Party and Fringe Party, would having very solid, friendly leadership, strong leadership, would that help build more popularity and possibly a seat, especially in terms of Jack Layton, who seems like he was one of the best leaders for the NDP when it came to the Orange Wave.
Yeah, no, leadership matters, but let's face it, the NDP were not a fringe party at the time that he had that success. They were, at the time we were thinking, we had a two-party plus system. The NDP had been around for quite some time. So certainly leadership matters, but also by then the party had actually become a lot more pragmatic. They had really they had already started engaging in compromises, and they weren't so true to their original roots, their very left of center roots. They were much more pragmatic. So I think it was a combination of things. And quite frankly, that election, Jack Layton had a personal story. He was able to really articulate in a very dramatic way his understanding of the healthcare systems and the flaws in it. He had undergone some surgery, but he was walking around with a cane, and I remember clearly at the end of his rallies he would raise the cane and talk about how he would fight for Canadians because he understood. That's a really compelling narrative, and certainly you can see why it was so effective in getting him elected.
That made a huge historical impact, even though it isn't a fringe party or splinter party. It just goes to show how difficult it is for even those smaller parties to gain more traction with Parliament.
Yeah, well, it's traction with the electorate and getting people to vote for them. I mean, again, we are a regionally based electoral system, and you've got, the issue with the NDP currently is that they just have an inefficient vote. They don't have any big geographic area that they can count on to vote for them in election after election, and so that's so whatever their poll numbers are, it's sort of spread across the country more or less evenly, which means it's difficult for them to pick up any particular seat.
Very true. Very true. I just also wanted, my last question, in terms of Quebec, because it's very culturally distinctive, and they have their own charter and their own provincial parties and all that. Would that help other provinces if they could have that kind of autonomy in a way? Because I think some of Quebec, there are splinter parties. But I know the People Party of Canada, Maxime Bernier, he was part of the Conservative Party, but he's also French. And from Montreal, I didn't know if that has something to do with his politics. I don't think he supports Quebec nationalism, but just Quebec by itself, I think they do have more splinter parties and division because of their own culture and all that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think every province has a unique history and has had changes in the party structure, I wouldn't say that Quebec's any different than any other region in that regard. I mean, certainly they have the Parti Québécois, but they also have the CAQ, and they've had different machinations of it. But I think about BC politics. Again, they had social credit. They've had the NDP in power. They have almost a two-party state currently with the Liberals and the NDP, but they're not the same as the federal Liberals and NDP. Saskatchewan has a Saskatchewan party. So I think that we do look at Quebec and we think that they are somehow unique because perhaps the language and the different cultural changes. But when it comes to party politics, they're not that much different than the rest of us, and I don't think that there's any sort of particular thing about their party system that's that much different than any other regions.
Good to know. I wasn't sure. I just thought I'd ask your opinion on that.
That's fine.
And I think overall, Fringe Party and Splinter parties, they are incredibly important and valuable. Like, it signifies that we live in a democratic Westminster, parliament and country where we're able to create and register for political parties through elections, Canada. And not all countries around the world have this, democratic ability to do that. So I think it kind of shows that we're a very unique country, and because we're very multicultural, and we can share our different voices and views, even though Fringe parties are very small, you're still able to make that, you're still able to register for that political party and voice your concerns. I just think that's what makes Canadian politics quite unique, especially with the splinter parties as well. I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments on that, but
I mean, I guess I just don't know if we're that unique on that regard. I mean, when I look around the world, there's all sorts of different parties and splinter parties, and some are more effective than others in other countries because they have different electoral systems. So I really can't comment on that one way or the other.
Yeah, I just think it goes to show that the Canadian politics is very unique, and where anyone can register for a party and voice their concerns. Well, those are all the 6 questions I wanted to ask today. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and time. It's very interesting to hear your viewpoints on all of this.
Okay, well, it was my pleasure. Nice talking to you.